Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you here today to the Mandel School. Welcome to the former ambassador to Israel and to Egypt, Dan Kurtzer, and to Sheila Kurtzer. Welcome to the president of the university who came to greet us here, and to all of our colleagues in the different departments who came to hear Professor Kurtzer and the students and people from the community at large. My name is Elisheva Baumgarten. I'm a historian here at Hebrew University, and I'm the academic head of this building, the Jack Joseph and Morden Mandel School for Advanced Studies in Humanities. I want to begin this talk in the way I begin every class I teach this term. So I will tell you that if you didn't already remember that, today is day 439 of the war, a war in which we still have 100 hostages alive and dead in Gaza. The war is continuing in Gaza and up north, and we have people displaced from their homes for over a year already, both on our side of the border, up north and down in the south, and also many, many people who are suffering death, injury, and displacement on all the different borders of our country. I say this not to take away from what we're doing here together, which is learning, and we've all come here to study and to know more. And that's what we do here in this building. Specifically, all of our students are here almost daily doing research. But I say this because we can't pretend that we're living our normal lives and that this situation is not ongoing. I personally believe that each of us has to do whatever he or she believes is the right thing to be doing at this time. But it's certainly not just sitting and studying. It's more than that. Usually in my classes, I talk about a hostage. In many of my classes already, my students are asking to come up and talk about a hostage whom they know instead of me. And I think that's a way to keep these people who are still in captivity in our minds all the time. But right now, I'll just say that we should have them home as soon as possible. Maybe we could have a Hanukkah miracle. That would be really, really nice. So this opening, of course, is related to today's event. Even if there was not a war going on, I'm sure that my colleague, Professor Presbar Natan, and myself would have wanted Professor Kurtzer to come speak to us today, because there's so much to learn from him about this area, about policy in this area over the years. But of course, with what's going on now, I think it's all the more important for all of us to hear from him and really to hear a different perspective that perhaps we don't think of here in Israel, reading the local newspapers and reading the different things. So we would always be happy to have Professor Kurtzer speaking here today, and today it's an even greater pleasure to welcome here. Others will introduce him and his CV and tell you more about him. So I'm just going to say thank you. Thank you for being here. And we look forward to hearing you. And I want to invite the president of the university, Professor Asher Cohen, to say a few words.
Hello, everyone. First of all, I'll echo what Elisheva said. We need the hostages back home today. And everything she said is right there. I'm happy to be here in the presence of Ambassador Dan Kurtzer and Sheila. To me, Dan Kurtzer is the mythological ambassador to Israel. People don't, you guys, many of you are too young for that to know, but he had a huge presence as an ambassador to Israel and as an ambassador to Egypt. And I think it would be really interesting to hear his perspective as someone that actually is a fan of Israel, but he knows the area no less than anyone else around, and has a perspective that is good for us to hear. We sometimes hear too much our own perspective and don't listen too much to what others have to say. And we have here a unique opportunity, I think, to hear a very wise look at the situation here. So I'm looking forward to hearing you, and thank you very much for coming and agreeing to give us the lecture.
As I said, the Mandel School is a humanities center, and everyone here studies different areas in the humanities. And it's a huge pleasure for us today that this event is not just a humanities event. It's one that we're holding with the Faculty of Social Sciences. Of course, some of the things we study here and some of the things that are studied in social sciences have overlaps, but often our students don't get to hear things in the different faculties. And for today, we are co-sponsoring this event with the Leonard Davis Institute for International Relations. I want to say personally, this was a huge pleasure for me to get to know Galia. I didn't know her beforehand, so it's always nice to get to know another colleague and to have a wonderful experience working with them. And I want to thank her and her team, Chanoch Wolpe, and also our team here at the Mandel School, Irina Dostov and Abigail Rosenstein, for helping set up this event today. And I want to call upon Galia to chair the event, and she'll run it from now. So thank you, Galia.
Okay, hi everyone. So in case you don't know, my name is Galia Pressbar-Nathan, and I'm from the International Relations Department, and I'm the academic director of the Leonard Davis Institute for International Relations. And before I move on to thank Dan and talk about him, I want to thank Elisheva for this cooperation. I'm a big believer in social science humanities cooperation. Everyone talks about interdisciplinarity. It's the big, the big word, but it's easier to talk about than to actually practice, a bit like peace, I guess. So thank you for this. And there are very few people you can actually correspond with on WhatsApp at 6:40 in the morning. So yeah, okay. Okay, so again, I'm very honored to have Professor Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer with us here, and I welcome his wife Sheila also. Thank you for coming. And as the president noted, most of you are just too young to really appreciate, the person that is coming to talk to us today. But and I should say, everyone here is all the students here are international relations students, and what you have here is a former career diplomat, U.S. Foreign Service person for 29 years, right? Okay, which is quite incredible. So should I say ambassador, Professor Kurtzer was both the American ambassador in Egypt between 1997 and 2001. And right after that, he became the ambassador in Israel from 2001 to 2005. And most amazingly, at least my friend Wikipedia said that Ambassador Kurtzer was already a junior officer in the embassy in Cairo when President Sadat was assassinated, which is, okay. We don't need a talk, we need a course, but that's afterwards. Okay. So this, at least there are at least two remarkable things that I wanted to note on this issue. First, having served in these two countries, both in Israel and in Egypt, of course, we have a peace treaty, but we know these are like two sides of the most central sort of peace axis in the region. And also having served under a Democrat President, Bill Clinton, and then a Republican President, G.W. Bush. Today, that sounds okay, less possible, okay? But I think that's also, very interesting perspective. Ambassador Kurtzer was not just, this ambassador, but really involved in the Israeli-Arab peace process in so many ways in practice. And then after retiring from the U.S. Foreign Service in 2006, he continued working on the Middle East and the peace process in his new role in Princeton as the chair of Middle Eastern Policy Studies at the School of Public and International Affairs. And in this process, he also co-authored two really good books if you're interested in the peace process. I won't read all the names of the books. Okay, so in many ways, I think, President Cohn said that Dan Kurtzer was the mythological ambassador. I think is really the embodiment of this combination of the praxis and also the critical reflection of our region. And for those of you who are scholars here, in his website, there are actually 19 boxes of notes, right? That's what it says on the website. 19 boxes of notes and papers from 1978, all about your big and small events in Israel and Egypt, which is quite remarkable. So we have with us today, okay, a seasoned diplomat, diverse experience in the region, experience in the field here, in the field in Egypt, and in the field of the American politics, who doesn't shy away from offering candid and critical opinions and thoughts. And I don't think we could find a better observer of these trying, dramatic, and often surprising times that we are living in today. And that's, I think, Elisheva is right. It's especially interesting today because everyone's looking for these insights that, you probably can't provide. You can't give us, the solution, but we're all looking. So with this in mind, I'm very happy to give you the stage. We have a lot on our plate, a lot of things we can discuss. I am guessing because it remained sort of open, lots of questions on the table, the future of the war in Gaza, the so-called day after, which is actually should be today, the two other fronts that were added since we started talking about this talk in June 2024. So we have Lebanon, we have Syria. There are big questions about the U.S., what the U.S. can, should, and would do. 3 different questions, I think, to deal with all these challenges. What should Israel do? What can it do? How do all these regional events impact American domestic politics? We're in a post-elections period. Interesting to see how much of what happened here actually sort of ended up impacting what's happening in the U.S. And then the flip side of this, to look at how American domestic politics actually impacts foreign policy, and therefore we should be interested. You'll end up talking about whatever you want, but I think I sort of covered most of the big questions that are on the table. So our plan is to have Ambassador Kurtzer talk for about 40 minutes. And then we will do Q&A, and we want to hear you and raise more specific questions here. We will end by 6, and then Ambassador Kurtzer was nice enough to be willing to stay around. We'll have some light refreshment outside at 6, and we can have more informal discussions outside for another half an hour or so. That's the plan. Okay, so I'm very, very happy to have you here, and the floor is yours, and I'll shut up.
Tzarayim Tovim. I would not be truthful to you if I said that I don't enjoy listening to those introductions. And I do want to thank Professor Cohn and Galia and Elisheva and the staff that made that possible. I do want to correct Professor Cohn this idea of mythological ambassador. I was in a taxi cab the other day, and the driver looked in his rearview mirror and said, "You look familiar." I said, "What's your name?" I said, "Dan." He said, "Oh, Dan." Keeps one's perspective real. I want to echo Elisheva's introduction. As much as those of us from abroad love Israel and try to comfort you during these past 14 months, we know it's impossible to truly understand what you've been living through, the trauma and the pain. Words in a speech can't capture the swirl of thoughts and emotions, the cruel fate of the hostages, now day 439 of captivity, and the pain of families and friends in mourning of lost ones burns through our souls. I'm not here to preach, as I have no answers to the dilemmas and the challenges that you face. I hope that there are things that can usefully be shared that are worth thinking about, especially lessons learned and unlearned from the past that might help in confronting some of the challenges of the future. 45 years ago, actually 55 years ago, I spent my junior year in this university in Givat Ram. I had been in Israel for the first time 2 years earlier, right after the 1967 war, but it was the year that I spent in this university that shaped what was to become my lifelong quest and involvement in the search for peace in the Middle East. In graduate school, I studied the region much more intensively and wrote my doctoral dissertation on Israeli-Palestinian violence before 1970. More on that later. What cemented my career and life choice, however, was exposure to the incredible faculty in this institution. Names that you probably don't know personally, but you read their names on the wall. Jacob Talmon, Shlomo Avineri, Galia Golan, Nechama Leibowitz, Alan Dowdy, and many others. Equally influential was a course that I took on the Arab-Israel conflict that featured very senior Israeli political and military personalities. More on that also later. To a 19-year-old from abroad, Israel seemed to be an exciting and at that time, relatively simple country. Yes, Israel was surrounded by enemies, but Israel had defeated those enemies in June 1967. Palestinian terrorists had resumed the fight almost immediately after the war, but Israel had driven the PLO at that time to Jordan. From there, after igniting a civil war, the PLO was driven from Jordan to Lebanon. Egypt, too, had resumed hostilities almost immediately after the war, in the War of Attrition. And the ceasefire achieved in 1970 was but a short respite from violence until the Yom Kippur War in 1973. Interestingly, despite this whirlwind of events in a very short period of time, Israel seemed like a very confident country, moving forward, building a modern society, while absorbing immigrants from all over the world. One of the many things noticeable in those days was Israel's willingness to learn from its mistakes. The IDF's success in 1967 was, in fact, a reflection of the deep study of the previous confrontations with Arab armies. And the IDF assimilated those lessons, and the result was the 1967 war. In many respects, this willingness to learn lessons and assimilate them was one of the shared values that the United States and Israel always talk about. Alexis de Tocqueville, the French aristocrat, diplomat, and historian, wrote what remains to be the most definitive work on American society in the 19th century. And he said the following, quote, "The greatness of America lies not in being more enlightened than any other nation, but rather in her ability to repair her faults." 55 years ago, I saw this in Israel as well. Today, however, seems different. Israel in 2024, like the United States in 2024, appears prepared to fight the lessons of the past rather than absorb and correct them. In the United States, repeating a mantra of "Make America Great Again," while tearing down institutions and political culture in our country, has turned into a sad and dangerous mantra. My fear is that there are some in Israel intent upon doing the same thing here. I cannot imagine the trauma which continues to grip the country. It was so horrible and so different from what Israelis had come to expect from their government and their army that it will take a long time to assimilate lessons and to learn from the mistakes. I will say some things today that will be challenging and hard to hear. And I say them understanding that coming from 6,000 miles away, I cannot teach you any lessons. But I say these things in the hope that they contribute to fixing problems that you are confronting. The talk today is entitled "The Gaza War in U.S. Policy and Politics." And as Galia noted, we agreed on this topic before The events in Lebanon and Syria and Iran changed the regional situation, and I'll talk about that a bit later. But I want to focus on 5 broad observations, and then to conclude with some specific thoughts about Gaza and the way forward. First, how did we get here? One of the most challenging questions, perhaps the most important question for policymakers and the public, is how did Israel get to where it is today? We know and have read about policy, military, and intelligence failures, but so far there have been no adequate answers to this fundamental question. It is baffling how Israeli leaders and intelligence and military professionals could have believed that Hamas could be a partner, whether in a hudna or anything else. I served in Israel in the early 1980s, from 1982 to 1986, as a political officer in the American Embassy. This was before Hamas had emerged as a movement. Part of my job was to travel to Gaza every week for 4 years, to talk to Palestinians, to try to understand Palestinian society, and to report to Washington on what Washington needed to know about what was happening in Gaza. Having come to Israel directly from a 3-year tour of duty in Egypt, again as a relatively junior officer, and having watched the activities of the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, in Egypt, I was sensitive to the indicators of the growth of extreme Islamism. During every visit to Gaza, starting in 1982, I saw those indicators at work. Money was pouring in, clearly being allowed in by the Israeli government. And there was a building boom in only one sector of Gaza society: mosques, dozens of Islamic NGOs and charities, and the Islamic University. At the same time, the nationalists in Gaza, the PLO, were being choked. I met with Gazans from all the factions and all strata of society. They knew this was happening. They knew it was known to the Israeli authorities, and they could not understand why. Nor could I. To be sure, I understood, at least intellectually, Israel's antipathy toward the PLO, which had conducted brutal acts of terrorism against Israelis over the years and had not accepted Israel's right to exist. But I could not understand the benign attitude toward the extreme Islamists, who harbored no less radical and no less extreme views about Israel than the PLO. Why then was Israel tolerating the spread of extreme Islamism in Gaza? Among my other responsibilities at that time was to liaise with the Israeli military government and civil administration. And so I met frequently at that time with Shlomo Goren, who was the head of the military government, and with his advisors on Arab affairs. I asked them why Israel was so relaxed about the growth of this extreme form of Islam in Gaza. I shared with them my experience in Egypt and offered the view that this extremist trend might not end well. The Israeli officials initially responded that I was wrong, that they were not allowing money in, they were not permitting the extremists to build, they were not focused only on the nationalists. But in the face of mounting evidence that I shared during every visit with them, they provided what could only be described at the time and retrospectively today to be an extraordinary answer. The Islamists, they said, were people of religious beliefs who wanted to expand the number of believers. They represented no threat to Israel. The nationalists, on the other hand, opposed the occupation and agitated for independence. And so Israel preferred the religionists over the nationalists. I can only call that an astounding response, because it crashed into a deadly reality about 4 years later, at the outset of the first Intifada, when Hamas emerged as a movement. Hamas's covenant openly declared and continues to declare that Israel should be destroyed. And that deadly reality of what Hamas was seeking reached its nadir on October 7th, 2023. During the preceding decade, before October 7th, Israeli policymakers again seemed to prefer to deal with Hamas and to facilitate the funding of Hamas while essentially shutting out the PLO. Never mind that since 1993, the PLO had been Israel's partner in a peace process, had accepted Israel's right to exist, had renounced terrorism, and had engaged in peace negotiations with Israel. We now know that Israeli leaders and Israel's intelligence had become wedded to a concept, a dreadful concept, that focused on assessing Hamas's intentions rather than on Hamas's capabilities, on its arsenal, its tunnels, its open preparations for attacking Israel. We know now that the Israeli military, based on this concept, was not prepared on October 7th to defend the people and the communities in the Gaza envelope. And we also know now that Israeli leaders not only bought into this concept, but also fostered it in the belief that this would deny once and for all Palestinian aspirations for an end of the occupation and for an independent state and sovereignty. Observation number 2. It seems very clear that a state commission of inquiry is vitally important as soon as possible to deal with these questions. The lessons from October 7th need to be aired publicly and studied carefully. Indeed, some of those lessons are very likely to mirror the conclusions of the Agranat Commission in 1973. This time, the outcomes must not only be known, but must inform future policy. In particular, the capabilities of Israel's enemies need to be prioritized over an assessment of their intentions. To be sure, there is an intimate relationship between the two, between assessments and capabilities. But Israel, like every other country, cannot allow an enemy like Hamas, or Hezbollah for that matter, to acquire significant quantities of advanced military hardware, to dig in via tunnels used both for defense and offense, or to practice attacking Israel in the open, as we know Hamas did in the run-up to October 7th. All of these factors were present in Gaza. And we know that many of your bravest officers saw this, but were not listened to. Many of these factors were also present in Lebanon. And while the burden of examining these issues will fall on the military and intelligence communities themselves, political leaders must never again lead the country astray by believing that Hamas is preferable to dealing with Israel's peace partner, the PLO. Observation number 3. 50 years ago, I submitted my doctoral dissertation to Columbia University, a study of the factors that contributed to the radicalization of some Palestinians to violence before 1970. I took as a given that many, perhaps most Palestinians who took up violence did so motivated by the hatred of Israel, by opposition to Israeli policies, and some of them were dedicated to seeing Israel go away. But I wanted to know whether this applied to all Palestinians who had engaged in violence, or whether there were other factors that came into play. I had examined these same issues in my master's thesis dealing with Algeria, the French effort to put down the Algerian Revolution. And in that study and in the doctoral dissertation, I looked at 2 additional factors that I hypothesized might be contributing to the radicalization of some people to violence. First, there were socioeconomic factors and political dynamics within the Palestinian community that might have prompted some of them to take up violence. Poverty was certainly a possible driver. Dissatisfaction with the status quo was another, and additional socioeconomic factors that might drive people to say they had nothing to lose by taking up violence against Israel. But I also assessed the role of Israel itself, as I had done in Algeria vis-a-vis the French, to see whether or not any of Israel's counter-terrorist activities, whether counterterrorism policy, was in fact a contributing factor in the radicalization of Palestinians to take up violence. Mine was not a quantitative study. We didn't have computers in those days, and I'm not a quantitative analyst. But I did amass some data on the frequency of Palestinian attacks and the timing and impact of what were called in those days Pe'ulot Tagmul, reprisal raids by Israel. This produced a quite interesting chart, which if we had computers would have been even more interesting. Over a period of time, Palestinian attacks would escalate in number and severity until Israel conducted a reprisal raid. This would drive the number of attacks down to zero for a period of time, but then the Palestinian attacks would resume with greater frequency and greater intensity than they had before the Pe'ulat Tagmul. This would drive that number down to zero again, but time and again, the same thing happened, leading to a chart that looked like this. This being the point at which Israel conducted a reprisal. Down here was the 0 point, and then up higher was the frequency and severity of attacks. So I wrote a letter to Yehoshaphat Harkabi, former professor here, former general in the IDF, had been the head of military intelligence. And I had met him when I was here my junior year in university. He was one of the lecturers in the course on the Arab-Israel conflict. And I sent him my rudimentary chart, and I told him what was bothering me, why didn't Israel see what looked like an obvious correlation of sorts between the rising level and intensity, the Israeli reprisal, and then the growing intensity and severity. There are probably a couple of you in the room who knew Professor Harkabi. He didn't deal well with silly questions. And he considered mine to be a silly question. And the letter which he wrote back almost immediately, which unfortunately I did not keep, basically said, and I'll almost quote it, "You don't know what you're talking about." General Harkabi said that the IDF's mission was to bring down the level of violence to zero. If that level of violence went back up, the IDF's mission was to bring it back down to zero. And if it went back up again, the same thing. Not responding to the fact that there might be a correlation between the types of reprisals and the growing intensity and severity of the attacks themselves. Now, why is this particular issue from my dissertation of any interest in 2024? To be truthful, it was not a great dissertation. I rushed to get it out because I had been accepted into the U.S. Foreign Service, didn't want this hanging over me. But it came in handy years later when I returned to Israel as the American ambassador in the middle of the Second Intifada. In one of my early meetings with senior IDF officials, I told them that I thought that I understood Israel's counterterrorism doctrine, having studied it over the years and been part of the American government's analytical section that deals with Israel. But I asked them to explain Israel's counterinsurgency doctrine. At first, the question seemed to puzzle my interlocutors. But then one of them reached for a pamphlet behind his desk and said, "Here it is." When I opened it up, it turned out to be a Hebrew translation of a U.S. manual on counterterrorism that was done at Fort Bragg in our counterinsurgency school in the U.S. Army. Now, I thought at the time that perhaps Israel simply didn't want to share their doctrine with me. as close friends as we are between Israel and the United States, there are obviously things that we don't share. But it was also clear over time that Israel didn't have a counterinsurgency doctrine. To be clear, a counterinsurgency approach assumes that the counterinsurgent, in this case Israel, could win the hearts and minds of the people. But this is not a realistic option for Israel as counterinsurgent. Palestinians will be extremely unlikely to admit to a preference for Israel, in other words, to allow Israel to win their hearts and minds, even if they oppose the violence of some members of their community. Thus, instead of trying to win hearts and minds, an unrealistic goal, counterinsurgency approach would be to separate the terrorists from the population at large, so as not to hold the entire population responsible for the actions of the terrorists. And so I had a recurring conversation with Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, who was the Prime Minister during my entire period of service here, on this subject. Suicide bombers were attacking Israel every few days during the Second Intifada. The Prime Minister repeatedly would order the closure of Gaza so that Gazan workers, at that time perhaps 80 to 90,000 workers, were not permitted to enter Israel to work. This would go on for several weeks, which meant that 80 to 90,000 Gazan families were deprived of an income during that period. And it meant that, in a sense, the terrorists had won the day, because Israel was punishing a population for the actions of a few. I would ask the Prime Minister about this. We met very frequently. And I expressed the view that perhaps Israeli policy itself was fostering the anger and the hatred among Palestinians. Not those Palestinians who were engaged in terrorism. They already were committed to violence, but those who were not yet committed to violence. The Prime Minister responded every time almost with the same answer. He said, my job is to stop the next suicide bomber from entering Israel, and therefore I have to close Gaza so that those 80 to 90,000 workers would not come in, among whom might be the next suicide bomber. Of course, he was right, because if you did close Gaza and 90,000 people didn't come in, the next suicide bomber who might have been among that 90,000 would not have been able to enter. But I thought I was right too, and I hearkened back to what Harkabi had told me years earlier. That is, Israel during the Intifada, as would be expected, was intent upon bringing the level of violence down to zero, not to allow the next bomber to come into Israel from Gaza. And this was being done without reference to what that might mean the next day, the so-called day after. Prime Minister was fighting a campaign of counterterrorism, whereas I was talking to him about a campaign of counterinsurgency. It took 4+ years. The Intifada ultimately ended, suggesting that in the short term, the Prime Minister was right. But the violence never really ended. And the scope and extent of violence worsened over time. More Palestinians turned to ever more violent attacks on Israel. Attacks were conducted either in organized group fashion or by individuals, so-called lone wolves. Let me be clear, I'm not suggesting that I knew better than the Prime Minister about how to protect Israel. It was his job. My job was to be supportive as the ambassador of the United States. But I wondered then, and continue to wonder now, whether a different approach might have worked better, an approach that offered the Palestinian population that was not engaged in terrorism a positive alternative to the violence of resistance. More on this in a moment. Observation number 4. Vladimir Jabotinsky's Iron Wall is required reading for all students of Zionism. He starts his essay with a stark statement, quote, I am reputed to be an enemy of the Arabs who wants to have them ejected from Palestine and so forth. It is not true, end quote. He follows that with an equally stark commitment, quote, I am prepared to take an oath binding ourselves and our descendants that we shall never do anything contrary to the principle of equal rights, and that we shall never try to eject anyone, end quote. I'll come back to this in a moment, but want to focus now on another of Jabotinsky's core messages, to look at the familiar Iron Wall, the famous essay he wrote in the late 1920s. It's a long quote, so bear with me. Quote, what is impossible is a voluntary agreement. As long as the Arabs feel that there is the least hope of getting rid of us, they will refuse to give up this hope in return for either kind words or for bread and butter, because they are not a rabble, but a living people. And when a living people yields in matters of such a vital character, it is only when there is no longer any hope of getting rid of us, because they cannot make a breach in the iron wall. Not till then will they drop their extremist leaders, whose watchword is quote unquote never, and the leadership will pass to moderate groups who will approach us with the proposal that we should both agree to mutual concessions. Then we may expect them to discuss honestly practical questions, such as guarantees against Arab displacement, equal rights for Arab citizens, Arab national integrity. And when that happens, I am convinced that we Jews will be found ready to give them satisfactory guarantees so that both peoples can live together in peace like good neighbors. Vladimir Jabotinsky. In many respects, Jabotinsky has been proven right. For decades, Israel's neighbors refused to accept Israel's right to exist and believed that over time they could destroy Israel. They tried often and they failed. Finally, they began to accept the reality of Israel, and what we have called the peace process was launched. One of the proudest moments of my own career was being a part of Secretary of State James Baker's peace team. We brought about the Madrid Peace Conference, an extraordinary breakthrough on the road to what we hoped would be peace. Peace treaty in Egypt, 1979. The Madrid Peace Conference, 1991. The Oslo Accords in 93. Peace treaty with Jordan in 94. In 2020, normalization agreements with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. In 2002, Saudi Arabia had proposed what became known as the Arab Peace Initiative. It's a remarkable document and well worth reading again because it offered peace and security in exchange for an end of the occupation and the creation of an independent Palestinian state. The Arab League and the Islamic Conference signed on to the Arab Peace Initiative. To be sure, it was not a perfect document from Israel's perspective. It was an opening that demanded a reply, but no reply has been forthcoming from Israel. The region had changed. The question, however, is whether Israel's strategic concept had changed accordingly. You recall that for the first decades of Israeli independence, Israel correctly assessed Arab attitudes as focused on Israel's elimination, and this drove Israeli policy to cultivate what was called the periphery, relations with Iran, Turkey, and Ethiopia, as well as relations with minority groups throughout the region that might be allies against the Arab regimes that sought Israel's destruction. Today, however, Israel's interests are allied not with countries on the periphery, but with the Arab core. Changes in Arab attitudes and policies did not occur out of love of Zionism or love of Israel. They came as a result of Israeli power, military, economic, technological, and societal, that persuaded Arab states that Israel's iron wall could not be breached. But there was, and there is a catch. The Arab states insist on a resolution of the Palestinian issue. They want Israel to forego annexation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and they want a serious process that leads to an independent Palestinian state. And there's the rub. Notwithstanding the peace treaties, notwithstanding the Arab Peace Initiative, notwithstanding normalization, the Abraham Accords, there's an anachronistic mindset that prevails among some people here that continues to oppose the idea that would unlock peace with the Arab world. Now, we know that it's a mindset that drove Zionism in the pre-state period. It helped build this country through pioneering settlement and the kind of activities that you learn about and maybe your parents or grandparents or great-grandparents participated in. But today, 76 years after Israeli independence, it's a mindset that continues to prefer Israeli settlement in the occupied territories and the dispossession of Palestinians from the land they own and live on. It is a mindset that prefers conflict with the Palestinians rather than seeking peace with the Palestinians and the Arab states. Settlements have been a constant irritant since 1967 in any effort to make peace. And they continue to be an irritant today, even in the midst of a complex war on several fronts. Think about it. During these 14 months of warfare, while Israel has been fighting Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the IRGC, the Houthis, Iran, militant settlers, too often under the benign, watchful eye of Israeli authorities, have harassed and attacked Palestinians in the West Bank and have continued to grab land for settlements. Now, this is not my analysis. Several weeks ago, the director of Shin Bet, Ronen Bar, addressed a letter to the Prime Minister and other ministers, and he said the following, quote, "The damage to the state of Israel, especially now, and to the vast majority of the settlers, is indescribable. Global delegitimization, even among our greatest allies, spreading thin the IDF's personnel, which is already struggling to keep up with all its missions and which wasn't intended to deal with this. Vengeful attacks that are sparking another front in the multi-front war we are in, putting more players into the cycle of terror. A slippery slope to the feeling of a lack of governance, another obstacle to creating local alliances that we need against the Shiite axis, and above all, a massive stain on Judaism and us all," end quote. Even more astounding, and we hear it today from some settler leaders and from some ministers in the Israeli cabinet who want to resettle Gaza. I was serving as the US ambassador when Prime Minister Sharon made the wrenching decision to disengage from Gaza. We know it was wrenching because Sharon was the father, the architect, the engineer of the settlements in Gaza. But Sharon came to understand that the settlements had become a burden on the IDF and on Israeli society. And they sent a clear message to the Palestinians that they would not have the territory on which to build their own state. So these actions, even today, land confiscations, expanding settlements, legalizing illegal outposts, the machazim, extending Israeli law to settlers and settlements, and especially settler violence that goes unpunished, are not only a stain on the character of the state, they also fly in the face of Arab willingness to normalize relations and to make peace with Israel. They ignore every lesson that Jabotinsky tried to impart. Observation number 5. So let's return to Jabotinsky for a moment. He had important things to say specifically about Palestinians. Quote, "Politically, my attitude is determined by 2 principles. First of all, I consider it utterly impossible to eject the Arabs from Palestine. There will always be 2 nations in Palestine, which is good enough for me, provided the Jews become the majority. And secondly, I belong to the group that once drew up the Helsingfors program, the program of national rights for all nationalities living in the same state. In drawing up that program, we had in mind not only the Jews, but all nations everywhere, and its basis is equality of rights. I understand it's difficult today, in the midst of what is still the post-trauma of October 7th to conceive of Palestinians as partners in a process of peacemaking. Too many Palestinians cheered the barbaric attack of Hamas. Even more remain silent in the face of Hamas's horrific actions. This is a stain on Palestinian society. But it's imperative to remember the Palestinians have been engaged in peacemaking with Israel for over 30 years. Many ups and downs, many disappointments, many missed opportunities, but also many understandings on core issues, including on territory and security. So let's consider now what might follow or what should follow the war in Gaza, the so-called day after. We must plan for something more than simply reconstruction, governance, and security. Any plan for the day after that ignores the underlying conflict is a guarantee for another war in the future. A year from now, 3 years from now, whenever. It is time to end this war, to bring the hostages home now, and to ensure that the communities around Gaza, like the communities in the north, can rebuild in safety. There are a number of critical requirements that underpin whatever is to be done in Gaza when the war ends. First, Gaza and the West Bank must be treated as a single unit. If a two-state solution is ever to come into being, Palestinians will be accepting the reality of having only 22% of their historic homeland as a state. And it's not logical or reasonable to believe that they will accept a separate entity in Gaza and a separate entity in the West Bank. Israel cannot maintain a long-term presence in Gaza. The transition to Israel's withdrawal from Gaza will take some time, but it must end with a complete evacuation of Israeli forces. I don't doubt that arriving at this outcome will be challenging, but it's going to be a requirement. Third, it's in everyone's interest for the Palestinian Authority to govern in Gaza. For this to be effective and credible, the PA must look into the mirror and must undertake reform. This has to take place as a result of internal Palestinian decisions, not those engineered from the outside. But reform is an absolute necessity, it's not a luxury. Fourth, to the extent that any identifiable Hamas members remain in Gaza, they must give up their weapons. The entirety of Gaza should be demilitarized with no military weapons and only weapons in the hands of Palestinian Authority security forces. And Hamas members must not be permitted to participate in Gaza's governance as Hamas members. Palestinian Authority must be the sole governing authority. As challenging as it will be to reach agreement on these requirements, there will remain a number of critical questions. Who will be in charge of law and order, internal security, basic services, and interim governance? Who will be responsible for monitoring the agreement, for holding the parties accountable for carrying out whatever they had accepted to do? At what point can the Palestinian Authority resume or assume the primary roles of governance and security? How will spoilers be dealt with? And who will fund the reconstruction of Gaza and the Israeli communities in the Gaza envelope, with the assurance that that money will not be lost if there's another war? The policy community and think tanks here in the United States and elsewhere have done substantial thinking about these issues. I participated in such exercise with the United States Institute of Peace. They have our ideas. They've had them now for 12 months. And we know that there are dozens of ideas and plans, some of them probably better than the ones we put forward. And the administration there and the administration here hopefully are considering those ideas. But even as the ceasefire hostages agreement gets hammered out, policymakers have to turn their attention to actually implementing a plan, all of which will arise suddenly on the day that a ceasefire and the hostage release process begins. However, a Gaza-only plan, as difficult as that will be to implement, will not be enough. A credible, sustained effort at peacemaking must take place in parallel with these activities. In this respect, no one knows what a second Trump administration will bring. 4 years ago, Trump proposed a peace plan that was rejected globally. It does not, therefore, represent a starting point for any serious peace process. Indeed, the president-elect's mercurial personality, narcissism, his penchant for policy by Twitter, rather than serious policy planning, suggests that it will be up to Israel and the Palestinians themselves to revive the process of peacemaking. No one expects miracles, and rebuilding trust and confidence will take time, but it will need to start immediately on the day after. Over the years, I've written extensively about the necessary ingredients of peacemaking. None of them is easy, and none will eventuate without determined leadership in Israel and Palestine. It is worth reviewing several of those ingredients in anticipation of the revival of a political process. First, there has to be a commitment to reach a two-state outcome. It's not clear today that this commitment exists either in Israel or in Palestine. Thus, leaders need to lead and to make the case within their respective political systems to work assiduously toward a peaceful outcome. Second, people-to-people activities, so-called bottom-up, should restart and expand in parallel with top-down, with government-to-government engagement. Start talking to each other again. Professionals ought to get together to talk about their experiences in health, technology, poverty alleviation. The possibilities are endless. Some of you already engage in such dialogues. More such contacts are critical to change attitudes and push back the opponents of peace on both sides. Third, government policy analysts, think tanks, academics, and the public at large need to grapple with the options for the future. You all know far better than I how little the peace issue has figured in Israeli electoral politics. This is strange and sad, as the peace issue should rank a close second behind security. And in fact, peace and security should be the top of every Israeli electoral agenda. If an assessment of peace prospects does take place, there will be at least 4 options to be considered. Each has benefits for part of the Israeli public, and each has risks. What are the 4 possibilities? One option, under current discussion within the government, involves Israeli annexation of all or part of the West Bank, and perhaps includes resettling and annexing parts of Gaza. This is a prescription for eternal conflict, as Palestinians will never accept an outcome that leaves them with less than the area that constituted the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem in 1967. The second option is to establish a binational state between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. You know, however, that this represents a classic Hobson's choice. If you accept that Palestinians and Israelis will enjoy equal citizenship and rights in a binational state, you are putting into jeopardy the Jewish character of Israel and essentially deciding that Zionism is finished. But if you do not accept that Palestinians and Israelis will enjoy equal citizenship and rights, you are defining an apartheid state. Both of these options violate the Israeli Declaration of Independence. A third option is to continue creeping annexation. In fact, today it's more like galloping annexation, but not necessarily defining a final outcome. This has the political advantage of not forcing the Israeli public to make a decision. People don't like making decisions, but it is a surefire recipe for more violence. It will only be a matter of time until the pressure cooker of occupation and settlements and the denial of rights lead to an explosion. Intifadas 1 and 2 seemed to take the public by surprise, as did the horror of October 7th. But while the dynamics of each outbreak might not have been anticipated, it should have been clear that the status quo in 1967, the status quo in 2000, the status quo in 2023 was not tenable. So deciding not to decide might seem like a good option, but it's not, for it guarantees that your children and grandchildren and Palestinian children and grandchildren will be at war without an end in sight. And that brings us to the fourth option, the two-state solution. However maligned it is these days, I need not rehearse its benefits or to elaborate its challenges. Of all the options, it satisfies the needs of both Israelis and Palestinians for sovereignty and independence. If this option becomes the option of choice, there are common sense actions that could accelerate the pace and scope of peacemaking. For example, the United States, in consultation with Israel and the PLO, could lay out parameters on core issues that could be used as terms of reference when negotiations resume. President Clinton did this in 2000, and his parameters made eminent sense, for they reflected the progress that the two sides had made in the negotiations. Second, with the parameters in hand, the United States could sponsor a UN Security Council resolution, establishing those parameters as a new basis for negotiations, replacing the anachronistic Resolution 242, which was agreed in 1967. The United States and others could establish a monitoring mechanism, something we've never really had in the peacemaking process, to make sure that the parties fulfill the commitments that they've undertaken. Number four, steps could be taken immediately to start disengaging the Israeli and Palestinian economies. And you don't want to do that too fast because both economies would suffer. But if we are to plan for an independent Palestinian state, it will need to make independent economic decisions. And the only way to get that started is to start to disengage what is essentially a mercantilist economy that now exists between Israel and the occupied territories. Work has been done on this already in the X group in France, and it could be built upon if we decided to do that. And number five, we should encourage Palestinian institution and state building activities, such as those that former Prime Minister Salam Fayyad oversaw more than 14 years ago. Peter Jones, a Canadian academic, brings us back to Jabotinsky at this point and sums up the challenge today as follows. He says the following, quote, "The continued rigid application of the iron wall today can only be appreciated as an exercise in maintaining a state of conflict as a cover for the continued expansion of Israel. It is a recipe for endless conflict," end quote. I think the Arab world is ready for peace with Israel. It's critical to determine whether the Palestinians are ready for peace with Israel and whether Israel is ready for peace with the Palestinians.